one of the things that we are usually after when we are trying to gain knowledge is objectivity, right? We like to have objective knowledge. If somebody is just spouting their own opinions, we say, well, try to be a little bit more objective, right? The objective would seem to be good. It would seem to be what we want in our search for knowledge. At the same time, there are a lot of arguments out there trying to convince us that objectivity is either very hard to attain or just completely impossible. And in this video, I want to look at one type of argument that has that form. I think it's a very familiar argument. It's an argument that goes roughly like this. Objectivity is impossible. Why? Well, because we always see the world from our own perspective. And if you always see the world from your own perspective, then necessarily whatever you know about the world is going to be subjective and not objective. Period. End of argument. Right? So the idea of the argument is that on the one hand, we clearly see that our knowledge of the world is perspectival. It is from a perspective. And that, on the other hand, we clearly see that it's impossible to join perspectives, like this perspectival nature of our knowledge, with objectivity. And if we bring those two together, then objective knowledge would seem to be impossible. So let's think through this type of argument. And especially, let's start by thinking about what a perspective is. Right? In the most literal sense, a perspective has to do with where you are standing in space and from what direction you are looking at a particular thing. So if I am looking at a mountain from the north and you are looking at the same mountain from the south, then we have different perspectives on this mountain. And of course, we then usually metaphorically extend this notion of perspective, right? And we might apply it to things that don't have anything to do with like the specific direction from which you are looking at things. Like the physical direction from which you're looking at things. So I might say something like, well, you know, I'm here with what might be a white shirt, but since I'm standing under a red light, right, from my perspective, it looks red. Or we can look maybe at somebody's social position or their background or something like that. Like, yeah, from my perspective as an atheist, all these religious festivals make no sense. Right? That would be a much more metaphorical use of the term perspective, where suddenly a perspective has to do maybe with what I believe or with what my cultural background is or something like that. But let's start by focusing more on that immediate, like sort of the physical notion of a perspective. If that's what we have in mind, then there are several things we can say about perspectives. So first of all, perspectives are in a sense partial. Right? If I look at the mountain from the north and you look at the mountain from the south, then both of us see only part of the mountain. Right? We don't get the whole story. So perspectives are partial. And there are multiple of them. Right? They are plural. There's this perspective and maybe many others. Right? There could be as many perspectives as there are positions in space or something like that. So perspectives are partial and they're plural. There are many of them. And one might also think that they are distorting, right? That if I look at something from a certain perspective, I'm not seeing it as it is. But actually, I think it's a little bit dubious whether that is part of our normal thinking about perspectives. Right? I mean, there doesn't seem to be anything especially problematic or distorting about looking at a mountain from the north side. And if I look at a house, like from this distance, and so it seems gigantic from that perspective, is that a distortion? Well, I guess it's only a distortion if I don't realize from what perspective I'm looking at it. So, okay, maybe perspectives can distort, but maybe they don't have to. It's not as clear that that's part of the notion of perspective as the partiality or the being partial and the plurality. Okay, there's a couple of other things, a couple of very positive things, I think, that we can say about perspectives. Right? If I have a perspective on something, then I have a perspective on that thing. I have the thing in view. If I see the mountain from the north side, I'm seeing the mountain. That's good. So I have a view of the object. Also, perspectives can be altered, right? I can walk around the mountain and get different perspectives. And what's more, I can combine those perspectives, right? Either by walking around the mountain myself to get a better view, or maybe I can make a photo and you make a photo and we compare them, right? And we have a photo from the north and a photo from the south, and we compare them and we bring them together. And if we do that, if we take up multiple perspectives ourselves, or if we talk to other people who have taken up other perspectives, then we can combine those perspectives into one better, fuller picture of the object that we're looking at. So, perspectives are they give us partial information, but because we can change and combine them, we can use all that partial information to get a better and better and better and fuller and fuller and fuller picture of the object that we are investigating. So that sounds kind of optimistic, actually, right? There doesn't seem to be any relation between having a perspective and being unable to get objective knowledge, right? If somebody says to me, oh, you can never really know what the shape of the mountain is because you can only look at it from a particular perspective, then I will say, well, okay, but even a perspective gives me some information, and then if I combine different perspectives, I can get a pretty good sense of what the sort of objective shape of this mountain is, right? So, by itself, the notion of a perspective does very, very little to undermine the idea that we can get objective knowledge. Still, there is this very commonly heard argument that our knowledge is always from a perspective and that therefore we can't get to objectivity. So where is that argument coming from? Well, what I'm going to do in the rest of this video is I am going to follow a line of thought that was developed by the philosopher James Conant in his article The Dialectic of Perspectivism. It's a fairly long article, and for the most part it's about Nietzsche. So it's a reading of Nietzsche. But I'm not going to talk about the Nietzsche stuff. I'm going to talk specifically about James Conant's reconstruction of the logic that leads to, and then maybe leads beyond, this idea that perspectives make it impossible to get a view of reality. And so the way that Conant sets things up is he defines 4 stages of perspectivism. So what's the first stage of perspectivism? Well, a good way to understand the first stage of perspectivism is to think about René Descartes. So René Descartes, when he talks about our perception of the world, makes a distinction between, on the one hand, properties that are objective, and on the other hand, properties that only exist because we view the world from our human perspective. So, on the one hand, Descartes says, there are the properties that objects have themselves, and on the other hand, there are properties that they don't really have, you could say, but they seem to have them because of the way that our sensory apparatus and our minds work. And so for Descartes, in the first category, like the objective properties, the one that really belong to the objects, well, that's just shape and size and motion. So really the objects are just lumps of matter with certain shapes and sizes in motion. That's it. That's reality. On the other hand, there are things like color and smell and sound. That's how we experience things, right? Color and smell and sound, in a sense, don't really exist in the world. They exist only in our perception of the world. They're only there from our perspective. So, stage 1 perspectivism is a way of thinking about the world that says not just that we take up perspectives, right, and that this gives us only partial information. That was the common sense notion of a perspective, right? No, stage 1 perspectivism is a sort of philosophical view that tells us that certain properties that we ascribe to objects are merely perspectival, right? They exist only from a perspective and do not belong to the object at all. Objects are not really green or purple or sweet, right? What they really are certain sizes and shapes in reality, right? That's the Cartesian version, and of course you could come up with other distinctions, right, with other stories about what the real and what the perspectival facts are. But that's the idea. There are the real facts and there are the perspectival facts. And only some of the stuff that we experience is real and other aspects of it are perspectival. Okay, so once we have that thought, it's kind of natural to move on to what Conant calls stage 2 perspectivism. In stage 2 perspectivism, we start to worry about even those supposedly non-perspectival facts. Right? I mean, are they really non-perspectival? Like, is how we see things in terms of their extension and movement and so on, like these spatial features, is that how things really objectively are, or is that also only how things look from our perspective? Right? And so maybe we can get something like, let's say, Mary Shepard's theory, according to which, even size and shape are sort of mental properties like color and sweetness, and we don't really know what kind of properties in the objective world correspond to them. Right? It's kind of hard to find out, and maybe we can try to tell a philosophical story about that, or to stay a bit closer to ourselves in time. It's we might be reminded of the kind of physical theories that tell us that, it seems like there's a solid table in front of you, but actually it's almost all empty space. And in reality, there are only these tiny particles, these atomic nuclei and electrons, and that's all there is, right? And the solid object that you see around you, that's kind of an illusion. So really everything you see is an illusion, right? The color of the table is an illusion, but its solidity is in a sense also an illusion. Or we could think of these even more radical theories that we sometimes hear from theoretical physicists, where they tell us things like, the world is not really 3 or 4 dimensional, it's like 11 dimensional or 27 dimensional or who knows what, and we just experience it in a way that has very little to do with the actual reality underlying that. Okay, so in this second stage perspectivism, basically everything in our experience is now supposed to be perspectival, and like the real objective story about the world is very, very different. Right? It has very little to do with our experience. But if we're there, then it seems to make a lot of sense to move on to stage 3 perspectivism. And stage 3 perspectivism says, look, everything that we know, like including these theories about 27 dimensions, and really any other theory about the world that we could come up with, if it looks true, if it looks like something we should embrace, that's only how it looks from our perspective. Right? We're trapped in our perspective. We can't get out of our perspective. There's no way to go beyond the way that we experience the world to the real world that's as it is independent of us. And so reality is unattainable. Right? There's on the one hand reality, we would love to know it, but we're trapped in our perspective. Can't get there. So that's a very pessimistic vision, right? A very skeptical vision, where perspectives are supposed to generate an impossibility of getting at reality. Okay, says Conant, and here I think his reading of Nietzsche is very important. But once we are there at stage 3 perspectivism, it becomes incredibly useful, or incredibly natural, we should say, to move to stage 4 perspectivism. And in stage 4 perspectivism, we say, well, look, if everything that we can think about really is from our perspective, what's the use of postulating a reality that's independent of us anyway? Right? There are only perspectives. That's all there is, perspectives. Well, but by that stage, Conant suggests, it becomes kind of hard to see what the content of this theory is supposed to be. I mean, what is this claim that there are only perspectives? Right? This has nothing to do with the original idea of perspectives as, a particular way of looking at something. Right? I mean, my perspective of a mountain, it doesn't make any sense to say, there are only perspectives on the mountain, but there's no mountain itself. Because those perspectives are particular ways of viewing the mountain, right? You can't take away the mountain and keep the perspectives. It makes no sense. In other words, by the time we've reached stage 4 perspectivism, we have reached a philosophical theory that seems to follow more or less logically from these earlier stages of perspectivism, but it also seems to have almost no content, right? It's almost unintelligible. And why would we embrace something like that? And so Conan's suggestion is that maybe once we arrive at stage 4 perspectivism, we can see that we have made a mistake already in the beginning. Right? We should never have gone along with the idea that perspectives are something that stands between us and reality, that somehow makes it harder for us to get at reality, that veils reality, makes us unable to get there. Maybe what we should do is we should hold fast to this fairly common sense idea that perspectives are particular ways of getting reality in view. And Conan, when reading Nietzsche, describes the mature position of Nietzsche as a kind of positive perspectivism, a way of thinking about perspectives that actually, we could say, makes objective knowledge possible. And I want to read out what Conan says about that. So this is what he ascribes to the mature Nietzsche, but it's also something that he himself agrees with as the right lesson to take from this dialectic of perspectivism. So here's what Conan writes. 1. If something is to count as a perspective, as opposed to a mere illusion, it must afford a glimpse of the object which it is a perspective on. Right? So a perspective brings us in touch with the object. 2. We must alternate perspectives if we wish to gauge the object accurately. Right? A perspective is limited, so we have to take up multiple perspectives if we want to get some good knowledge about the object. 3. The glimpses afforded by one perspective must be compared with those afforded by another. 4. Only through such triangulation, so triangulation is really the idea of comparing like these different views, right? It's a term that comes from measuring land, I think, where you look at objects from different points in space and then you draw triangles and find out the exact spatial relations between them. Only through such triangulation can we attain knowledge. And 5, the more such glimpses we can compare, the more objective our knowledge may become. Right? So according to Conan, what Nietzsche tells us is that yes, our knowledge is perspectival, but the right way to go about that is not to despair, but to make sure that you view things from as many perspectives as possible. And combine them, bring them together, compare them. And that's the way that we attain objectivity. So perspectives are not between us and objectivity. They are the ingredients or the building blocks of objectivity. And at least to my mind, that sounds a lot more plausible than this despairing idea that, oh no, our knowledge is always from a perspective and so it can never be objective. Alright, there will be a video after this in which we think again about the nature of objectivity, what it means to be objective, and it's gonna come through a slightly different route to basically the same conclusion. That what we need in order to attain objectivity is we need to bring together different perspectives on the same object.